Good evening, good afternoon to you.
Hi, Katal. Good evening, good afternoon, everyone.
Well, welcome to you as well. Prashant is a professor at INSEAD of Technology and Operations Management. At INSEAD, he's working more specifically with our humanitarian research group and with the INSEAD Healthcare Management Initiative. He's also a visiting fellow with the Center for Global Development in Washington, D.C. And right now he's joining us, I don't know from which room of his home, but from Washington, D.C. As well. He's been a professor in many universities before joining INSEAD recently. He's also led the supply chain strategy of the Gates Foundation, and he's worked very closely with a number of global pharmaceutical companies. So you can see that his expertise on the supply chain domain has been with many stakeholders around their coordination. And at the moment, Prashant is also involved. He's deep in the conversation around how to coordinate this supply chain, and he's member of a number of working group and task force that are looking at how to improve the supply of these critical items. I forgot the name of all these groups you're part of at the moment, Prashant. Would you like to list them for us so that I don't forget anything?
Yeah, so thanks, Katal. So, first of all, I'm a supply chain academic, and as a part of that role, many formal and informal task forces and groups have reached out, and I'm helping them with whatever knowledge and expertise we can pull together, not just my own, but from other colleagues and peers at INSEAD and other institutions, including the Humanitarian Research Group, the Health Management Initiative. So most importantly, I think I'm working in an advisory role for the World Bank's supply chain management roles for the pandemic response for COVID-19, and also for a few hospital networks here in the United States who are trying to work with their sourcing teams and figuring out how can they get critical supplies. And in one or two occasional cases with third-party volunteer groups that have evolved to work with city officials, mayor's offices, and other local government officials. So that's the nature of work I'm involved in. Thanks, Peter.
Thanks, Prashant. So I just wanted to make sure you were hearing this as well, so that the insight we're getting tonight from Prashant are both based on his research as well as his involvement with a series of practitioners, again working with different organizations. And so what I'd like to ask you as we start, Prashant, is from that perspective, from these conversations you are in now, and based on your academic research, could you give us a lay of the land of how supply chains about medical and pharmaceutical items are currently organized? Who's doing what? What are the pain points? Because all of us are reading the news, all of us are seeing in all the countries we're based in that we are in a situation of critical shortage. So can you give us that big picture overview about where we're at and who's doing what, please, Prashant?
Yeah, so there are three kinds of efforts underway. One is a coordinated global effort, which is being run by the World Health Organization, the Pandemic Supply Chain Network, which is hosted by the World Economic Forum, UNICEF Supply Division, other groups who are essentially looking at what are the needs around the world globally and how can we coordinate supply and demand and match them better. So that's a global mechanism. Then there are national and subnational government efforts which are occurring in almost all countries. And wherever you're joining from today, this webinar, the country government and also subnational governments in your country are running a coordination effort to match demand and supply. And the exact nature of that varies from country to country. Its effectiveness, as we know, also varies from country to country. And a third level is what is being run by more local stakeholders, so hospital sourcing specialists of either a single hospital system or networks of hospitals, and local officials, including mayor's offices and other local government officials. So those are three levels of effort: a global one, a national, subnational government one, and multiple local efforts. And in the local efforts, I also want to mention there are multiple volunteer groups that have now emerged who are trying to match demand and supply, primarily in areas where they feel that either the global or the national or the hospital network efforts are not necessarily working. And that is something which is both tremendous upside and also potential downside, as you would imagine. So that's just the lay of the land. I don't know if you want me to get into specifics, Ketal, but that's how the architecture at this point is, which is not the architecture we use when it's a routine supply chain where companies sell directly to country governments or distributors, and a structure that we are much more familiar with.
Thank you very much. So some of the questions that were asked beforehand is where are the products currently being manufactured, and how do we ensure, what are the mechanisms that ensure that there is the places where there are needs? How does that work?
Yeah, so the list of medical supplies for COVID-19 itself is quite extensive. But let's focus on those which are in scarce supply scenario at this point. So we have infrastructure equipment and critical care equipment required in hospitals. So there is a lot of conversation, as many of you would have heard, about mechanical ventilators, ventilator equipment, and other supplies related to ventilators. They are manufactured across the world, so it's not a concentrated manufacturing in North America, US, LATAM, or Asia. We see manufacturers who are spread out across the world with differences in which markets they can sell to because of either regulatory or some other constraints, which I will get into. So that's one set of supplies. The other are what we commonly call as personal protective equipment, where once again, the N95 respirators and other kinds of masks are the ones that we are focusing a lot on. And there is a larger concentration of manufacturing, at least historically, that occurred in Asia, in particular in China and Southeast Asia. And this included manufacturers who are large US or European companies who have their contract manufacturing sites located in China. So that's for protective equipment. The third category is diagnostics and testing, which is, again, historically was concentrated more in North America and Europe. But the COVID-19 has also highlighted to us that there is significant capacity for both developing and manufacturing diagnostic and test equipment in China, in South Korea, in Japan, in lots of other places around the world. So that's on diagnostic and testing. And then one thing which we oftentimes forget is that as a result of COVID-19, it's not just the supplies that we need for COVID-19, it's also our ability to run the more mainstream routine medical supply chain. So making sure that people can get the medicines they want, those who are in chronic care conditions. And there again, we see a larger concentration of supplies, especially the active pharmaceutical ingredients, so one step removed from finished product, a large concentration in China, irrespective of whether the finished product manufacturing is occurring in North America, Europe, China, or India. So that's just geographically how different supplies are at this moment.
And so, again, what we're reading in the news, this shortage problem, is it first and foremost a supply capacity issue, or is it a logistical issue? Where is the problem coming from?
So I think it is both, but a part of the challenge is that we don't have good information to be able to pinpoint where our bottlenecks lie. And in some instances, we hear, ironically, we hear that there are suppliers and manufacturers who are saying I have excess supplies, and on the other hand, hospital sourcing specialists who are struggling to get even very small quantities of supplies. Examples are the respirators and the N95 respirators in particular. So I think in some instances, it's not just a supply constraint. It was a supply constraint until a few weeks ago, which has created the routine links that exist between a supplier and a demand center to be broken. And the new links aren't getting formed as quickly. And as a result, we see both, some people saying we have supply and some people saying, well, we are struggling to fulfill our demand. But that's not the case for all items. For things such as ventilators, we generally have a significant supply constraint.
Okay.
Even if we sum up supply across the world, we are much lower than what any demand scenario for the next 90 days is.
Okay, so that would be specific to the ventilators. So it's different problems based on different type of items. Is that correct?
Yes. And again, I think it's useful when all of you talk about medical supplies. I think it's useful to think about the four categories, in my opinion. So personal protective equipment, critical hospital equipment, including ventilators, diagnostics and test kits, and routine medicines and other medical supplies that are required for non-COVID patients, and just making sure that we give importance to all four of those product segments.
And what is the most critical problem? Under which one of these lay the most critical problem at the moment in your view, globally?
So like I said, I think the biggest problem is with ventilators.
Yeah.
And part of the reason is that the manufacturing ramp up is not as easy as it is for PPE, and also to some extent for diagnostic kits and testing equipment and reagents. And there we can scale up somewhat quicker. And that's what is leading to, you would have heard about efforts of repurposing manufacturers.
Exactly.
And things of that nature.
So let's talk about this a little bit, because several large businesses have come forward with some important announcement again for different type of items. LVMH, Firmenich around hand sanitizer, GM and Tesla making ventilators or announcing that they will make ventilators, or Zara that they will also provide apparel for medical staff. So realistically, this is not a possibility for all businesses to make such announcement and to volunteer. So for which company does that work? Is it possible? Which company can follow suit? And if they have the capacity to do so, how can we ensure that that's done in a coordinated manner as well?
Yeah, that's an excellent question, Catel, and I think that's something that most of us are struggling with at this point. So for things such as equipment manufacturing, so let's say ventilators and anesthesia machines, there in the medium term, we can imagine a scenario where a different manufacturer who's not in the medical equipment business repurposes their production, reconfigures it to make high-end critical care medical equipment. And so that's a somewhat medium-term scenario, which may not get us additional supply in the next 60 days. What is the other interesting portion for companies who are in engineering and industrial manufacturing is, can we create partnerships so that those companies which are currently in the ventilator or in the critical care equipment manufacturing business and are working hard to ramp up their capacity, and it's not sufficient to say we'll run 3 shifts instead of 1. They also need to, in some cases, do some reconfiguration, rejigging of their production lines, put in anything and everything they can put in about lean manufacturing. Those are areas where other companies who are not in the medical device manufacturing business, but are in discrete part manufacturing, can come in and partner and lend their expertise to medical equipment manufacturers. And we are seeing some of that happen organically when 2 company executives come together, but there isn't a clear forum. The Economic Forum is trying to bring together such partnerships, but domestically in countries individually, there isn't a way for that to happen. And that's a role which the government can somewhat facilitate, but I think will have to happen from business leaders and platforms which bring together business leaders.
So very concretely, I work in a company here in France. I have a good sense that I could repurpose my production line. Who do I call? Where do I go? Do I reach out to my government? Do I try to get in contact with the World Economic Forum? Where is the entry point for this?
Yeah. So again, excellent question. I don't know if I have the best answer to this, but if it is for medical equipment, I would say every country government or most country governments have created almost a hotline for manufacturers who can assist on ventilator manufacturing, either by repurposing or by helping existing manufacturers in some other ways. If it's N95 respirators, there it's slightly tricky because the number of manufacturers who are trying to repurpose their existing lines or trying to get into the PPE business to help is quite large. And it's sometimes hard for governments to respond or connect or help all of those manufacturers as quickly. So that's where I think more local and organically grown supply and demand matching platforms would come into a better help. And some of them are starting, and if they don't exist in certain areas or some geographies, then I think I would encourage people to think about that. But when you build that demand and supply connecting platform, don't decouple it from other platforms that are existing. I mean, we know from our understanding of two-sided demand and supply matching platforms that the real value comes when you have significant number of suppliers and significant size of demand. So even if someone is attempting to create a more localized version for their geography, their subnational geography, or for their country, attempt to connect that to similar platforms that may exist elsewhere, or some kind of an umbrella structure. And I think in the case of N95, some of that is evolving, but in other cases, we don't have the equivalent of that yet.
Okay, and in that context, what's the role of governments and how do they come together or not to have the global coordination that is needed, so that no one goes for it alone, just for the sake of their own countries. I mean, we've heard that there are now national restrictions to exports, etc., certain measures that are put in place. So how do we ensure globalization, global coordination in that context? What should be done there?
So firstly, I think we are seeing a very narrow form of nationalism in the healthcare value chain, and the healthcare and the medtech value chain, which we have never seen before. I think the healthcare value chain is a very global system where, I mean, if you look at pharma, supplies come from China, India, Europe, North America, and then all of that gets in a way matched to demand that occurs globally. Now, because of narrow nationalism, we are seeing silos evolving of this is only for my country, and export trends are coming up. So are governments coordinating well globally? Candid answer is no, because we see multiple export controls coming in. Can we do something to change that? Well, one thing that's important to keep in mind for those who are in the policy circles and are thinking about this narrow nationalism in production is the fact that it will hurt both our current ability to contain COVID-19 if we say production will happen in a very national manner, and it will also curb our ability to do long-term innovation in the medtech business. And both of these things depend upon a global system.
Yeah.
So I think that's just a constant reminder to those who are making these decisions. And when I say those who are making these decisions, it's not just necessarily government leaders. We have examples where industry bodies within a country, which include all of the top business leaders in a country, have advised national governments about issues like this. And so I think the voice of business leaders in this is important. And that's why I'm highlighting that this will hurt us both for the current response, and it'll curb long-term innovation in this business.
So can you give us a concrete example of where that's happened, which country?
So India has an export ban on a large number of active pharmaceutical ingredients, on PPE, also on some Medtech devices. Mm-hmm. That's one example. The list at this time is actually quite long, Ketal. It runs into so many countries who have instituted at least some form of export control. So I think I don't know if I can pick any one narrow example to highlight that. It's very widespread.
Okay. So the questions that are coming up here are specific to items on the issue of ventilator. Is that okay if we go on specific item and ask specific questions to you?
Can I make one quick comment, Ketal, before we get to specific questions? So I think we have to think about essentially 3 blocks of how we can be better prepared in this scenario and what we can do to mitigate. The first is, let's think about sourcing strategy in a more holistic manner and not one in a piecemeal way. And the example is that if you look at test kits, in the US, the bottleneck keeps shifting every week. Sometimes it's reagents, RNA extraction kit, swabs, machine reagents again, right? So if we work with one product at a time, then we are facing a dynamic shifting bottleneck problem, which we all know in the supply chain world is only going to keep changing our focus week to week. So we've got to think about overall strategy for testing, for critical care, and for PPE. Think about the different elements in that supply chain, identify where the bottlenecks will lie, and then start thinking about individual items. And in doing that kind of sourcing strategy, we also have to think about 2 or 3 modes of operating. So the current mode of operating for some of them may be supply scarcity. And then the second mode would be supply crisis. And we ought to be prepared for both of those modes, which means supply scarcity can be handled through different means, and supply crisis will have to be handled with slightly different means. So just keeping track, and this is dynamic, it's evolving, but keeping track of which one is in crisis mode and which one is in supply scarcity mode. And then the second is, we ought to start thinking about how do we match our measures on conserving supplies. And by conserving supplies, I mean, whatever can be done to shape demand, either at a clinic or a testing site or in a hospital, to match with this, what we call as the crisis supply state and the limited supply state, and have them clearly laid out with some notice, versus reaching a point that I have no more respirators left. Now what do I do? Having a plan that if we get to that point, here is how we will operate. We will relax the following assumptions on who can get it, and having them determined a priori and communicated will help us come up with demand scenarios for the limited supply case and demand scenarios when things get really in crisis mode in any given location. So that's the second part. And the related part of that is what I think many of us are putting our personal efforts in. How do we match and balance where we know that there is some supply and there is some demand? And I think in both of the modes, more so in the limited supply mode, fragmenting the market on the demand side hurts. As long as we have more consolidated demand side, then our ability to pull limited supplies is much better. But when you switch to crisis mode, completely crisis in supply, then I think once again, decentralized purchasing takes over, not because it's the more efficient thing to do, but that's just human nature, political things, and so on. So then we have to also be prepared for that setting. So anyway, I just wanted to lay that out before we get into specifics about items and products.
I mean, is that the end? I mean, and do we have a blueprint for this? How that functions, or is this the first time that we in such a complex situation at the global level?
We have a blueprint. That was the pandemic supply chain network was set up to do. To be candid, I do not think we have a blueprint for such a crisis on supply. I think the blueprint is what will be supplied from stockpiles, what will we get expanded supply for, how quickly we'll be able to replenish stockpiles, and so on. But we don't have a blueprint when we are saying our total ventilator supply will be, only a small fraction of our 90-day needs. So in that sense, it is unique, and it will be the first time we are building the blueprint, or people are at least trying to build that blueprint on the fly as things are evolving.
And so let's, if that's okay with you, let's go into a specific item now, because I see that there's a lot of questions that are coming up, and we actually have someone in our community here, Dr. Christoph von Lutzitz, who knows the issue of ventilators really well on that one, which is one of the critical supply shortage that we're having right now. And what he's saying is that from his perspective, knowing it well, the issue is more one of air freight capacity and security, and that the fact that stock gets stolen. So sharing that with you, reality check on this, and is this the reality? Is that the context we're in and the main problem around ventilators? That supply get stolen, and we need to have private aircraft or a system of delivering them that is different?
So air freight for ventilators is a big constraint. Are ventilators getting stolen? No, we hear anecdotally that, security is a threat. But right now, the big challenges are, how can we secure supply, and how do we find transport from wherever the factory is to the demand points? And I fully agree that air freight and transport is as significant a bottleneck for ventilators as manufacturing capacity in many instances. Okay. And that's why we also see that it's leading to countries focusing on their domestic ventilator manufacturers far more than looking at global sources. But soon we may reach a scenario where government intervention for transport would once again make the supply sourcing to be global, which can both hurt the system and can potentially make it better. Depends on how exactly it'll get executed and who will be in charge of coordinating from different demand points. But to answer the question, I'm not convinced that theft of ventilators is our biggest concern at this point. I mean, it may become if we continue on this pathway, but it isn't at this point.
Okay, thanks. There are also a number of questions that are coming up around the test kits. In certain countries, different headline news around that as well. So can you also explain to us concretely where these are manufactured today and how they're distributed? And then there is also a question around that about some who want to help small labs who can produce more of them and are wondering what are the distribution channels. Same thing. How can they help to provide more of these test kits?
Yeah, so I think testing is a big constraint. There are we think of testing to be of three types. One is the kind of testing that we saw used in the early days, both here in the United States and in Europe, which is more centralized labs which run these larger PCR machines that the bigger diagnostic companies have manufactured, and then they require swabs and reagents and some kind of viral specimen transport media. Each of them have become constraints at times. The second type are what we call as more the point of care diagnostics, which is a relatively newer. So Cepheid, which is a company in San Jose and has its European operations are in Lyon, has a product called Gene Expert, which allows a quicker 45-minute sort of point of care test. And they have, their test could speed up things. And the third is what we call as rapid diagnostic tests. So these were the ones that were first used in South Korea and in China. So for each of them, the modality is different. So if it's a company which has rapid diagnostic tests in China or in South Korea or other parts of Asia and are thinking, why aren't the United States and Europe using our product? I would strongly encourage them to look at the new guidance that's coming out from the regulatory agencies and government bodies, which is saying we are now ready to do emergency use authorizations for many new diagnostic forms. Same thing for point of care PCR types of tests, in addition to the one that Cepheid has. So to answer the question, yes, there is need for diagnostics. If someone has a product which has been clinically, shown to be efficacious, has been approved at least with either a CE mark or some other such regulatory mark, then I think there is a tremendous opportunity to connect with new markets. Once again, I would recommend connecting with both the Pandemic Supply Chain Network team and the WHO team. And if it's for a specific country in Europe or North America, then the medical regulatory authority in that country.
Okay, thank you. And I think there is a lot of questions related to stockpiling as well. Stockpiling of governments, stockpiling of individuals, of the army, of companies. Any information you could share about this? Do we actually have information of where we have stockpiling anywhere? Is this regulated? Is there any coordination around governments or guidance provided by any type of international organizations about what the rules are around this?
Firstly, I wanted to mention one thing, that the INSEAD Humanitarian Research Group works on this. There's been work looking at stockpiles in the past. There are, once again, three kinds of stockpiles here. The first stockpiles are global stockpiles, which are run by WHO, in the case of vaccines by Gavi and UNICEF. Then there are what we call a strategic national stockpile. So in the US has the SNS, which stocks a number of items, primarily with the need for pandemic medical control measures. And then there is the EU-wide stockpile, which has now actually put out its orders for ventilators. So there is a US, EU, larger stockpiles. Many other countries have their national strategic stockpiles. There is limited transparency on what sits in those stockpiles. There is greater transparency on what sits in the global stockpile at WHO, Gavi, UNICEF. And then the third kind of stockpiles are what private organizations stock. So we've heard in many cases that private companies have depleted their stockpiles and given their product to healthcare professionals, especially for PPE. So there again, I think there's limited visibility on what is sitting in the private stockpiles. So the answer to the stockpile question is, it is a great tool to both keep products in stock and create some stability of demand for pandemic items, because a manufacturer can't make large quantities and realize that it's a feast or famine approach. For a little while, there was everyone wanting my product and then no one wants it. So stockpile helps balance that. It can get replenished with a fixed replenishment cycle. Whatever excess is left, we can turn that inventory around and use it into routine use, especially if it's a product which has some routine use. However, the biggest challenge in stockpiling is, as you would imagine, a global and national coordination. And we are today at a point where multilateral coordination is at its weakest that we've seen. So expecting that we will have a coordinated global and national stockpile running in the COVID-19 scenario is being optimistic. However, we ought to create that better version when we all meet again on the other side of this tunnel and have the chance to redraw this architecture, I think that should be one of the first efforts that we all should spend our time on.
So we have 6 minutes left, and I have 2 clusters of questions, which are big questions. So just a heads up, you're going to have to answer complex question, big question in short amount of time. The first one has to do with the fact that this pandemic is hitting one country, one region, one after the next. And of course, there could be coordination around, supply chains, lessons learned from one country to the next as it hits and at its peaks in different countries. So how can we learn from one region to the other? How can we adapt supply chains, and how can we make sure that the supplies follow the need as the pandemic advances?
Yes, so I think this is great, Ketel. I think if you look at the groups that work in medical science, so infectious disease specialists, intensive care physicians, and epidemiologists, they have done a good job in learning from, or reasonably good job in learning from, China, South Korea, Singapore, Italy, Germany, US, and then at least very quickly figuring out what we know, what we don't know, how we can change our response better.
Yep.
The supplies community doesn't have the equivalent of that. So we don't know about how the supply situation in China or South Korea was managed. Was it critical? When it was critical, what kind of other demand supply connect models evolved, and how did hospitals in regions which had very critical supply needs and dwindling supply sources, what did they do? So I think we need to create something like this, so that as the pandemic passes to other countries, we do the similar thing for supplies. And there isn't a platform like this, but I think it's a great thing for all of us to collectively invest in.
Yeah, thank you. And okay. So I'm going to stop here, because then there is the other big group of questions which have to do with, the countries which haven't been hit fully yet. Those countries that, if you look again as the least prepared, if you look at the Global Health Security Index, all the bottom countries that are the least prepared, most of them low-income countries where we have most vulnerable population, sometimes health systems which are not extremely strong as a start. So what are the prospects for these countries, and what does the response look like? What are organizations such as the UN and the World Bank doing about that, and how can business contribute?
Yeah, so I think one is that the UN system, World Bank, the multilateral institutions have come together in an unprecedented way to provide financing for low and middle countries to get prepared better. Now, financing doesn't necessarily mean we can get supplies quickly. For financing to translate into supplies, there needs to be all of the things that we just talked about: identifying supply sourcing strategies, figuring out alternative suppliers, figuring out air freight and transport, and all the other things that we talked about. So what can businesses do? I think businesses can help in creating better knowledge around what capacity exists to manage supply chains, right? So if someone is saying we have origin destination air cargo capacity knowledge of what can go from China, EU to Africa, and we are in that business, then creating better knowledge around what such capacity is will help people figure out the sourcing strategy in a better way. And if it's very constrained, then knowing that also will help. So I think especially the businesses which are in logistics, air cargo transport, etc., can play a significant role. And if it's a business that is actively engaged in medical supply manufacturing, then of course, think about markets in Africa, Asia, which may not have been markets for you historically as a business, but now is the time to think about those markets more actively, and also work with the global agencies in trying to get your product out there, which can be both a good short-term strategy to help in the COVID-19 crisis, but also help build a more sort of diversified market presence for the companies.
Yeah, thank you, Prashant. I mean, of course, we could go on these questions, and also the context is evolving as we speak. I'd like to thank everybody, all of you, for asking questions, for also making a lot of suggestions. And on the website, we will not only capture the conversation of tonight, we will also put more documents, interviews, research papers, contact points also of agency that you can reach out to if you are interested. Before I wrap up, can you tell us what's make you the most hopeful as you are engaged in this conversation as of today? Because reading the news, it's hard to be hopeful. So, but for you, being in the thick of it, what are you most hopeful for dealing with this crisis now, and what's coming next?
What I'm most hopeful, Catel, is the fact that when I see physicians in hospitals, intensivists, when I see frontline health professionals or grocery delivery people, they are doing their job and they are making an ask for whosoever is in the business of supplying them in ways that they have not done before. And to respond to that, the supply chain community is coming under immense accountability pressure. And I think as a result of that, we will have to overcome our political differences, our agency conflict differences, and our hyper-nationalism issues to solve this. And that's the part that makes me hopeful and keeps me going at this day and night.
Thank you very much, Prashant. So thanks for taking the time for joining us in your very busy agenda. Thanks to all of you for participating in this first webinar tonight. You will find more on the web page. I think we have something coming up that gives you the link at the very bottom here, where more information, more documents, and more contacts will be provided. We can continue the conversation there. This is also a heads up for next webinars in the pipeline. The next one will be next Tuesday, 31st March. We'll be talking about leadership in a time of crisis. You can already sign up, so click on the list and register yourself. Also, a plea for us to give us feedback, as again, that was the pilot. In the last reminder you received right before the webinar, you have a link with 3 questions on a Qualtrics survey. Please click on it, respond, so that we improve this series as we go. Thank you very much to all. Have a good night. Stay safe and stay healthy. Bye-bye.